Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Jesse Singal. Jesse, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I am a socially isolated journalist, actually Skyping from an undisclosed location, not in New York at the moment, but yeah, I'm a contributing writer and former editor at New York Magazine. Write a lot about sort of social science in general, and abjectly terrified at the moment, as are we all.
Yeah, so this is the first one. The first one of these I'm taping since kind of the shelter-in-place self-quarantine rules or guidelines have been in effect. And so our topic is not coronavirus. We're going to be talking about something else. But I just did briefly want to mention, people have made this joke on Twitter, and it occurred to me as well that the Blogging Heads platform itself is years ahead of the curve and ideally suited to this moment because we can have conversations with people all across the world who are also stuck in their houses, and no viral transmission is at risk, and we've always Blogging Heads has always been people from their home offices and stuff like that, and there have been some jokes that the presidential debates will be held on Blogging Heads in the fall because it'll be the only option left. But yeah, so Robert Wright and Mickey Kaus were ahead of the curve when they came up with this, and Blogging Heads goes on despite all the craziness happening out there.
I've been saying for years that Blogging Heads, the whole ecosystem, is sort of best suited for a diseased, isolated society. So I feel like I've been proven right by that.
Exactly. Okay, so you are holding up okay under quarantine life?
Yeah, this is sort of the obvious bleeding heart point, but the difference between like having some savings and having access to family resources or social resources, I in New York in particular, just like walking around and seeing these restaurants that are scrambling to stay afloat with takeout, just restaurant and service workers alone, the extent to which I just feel really lucky is what I'm saying. Both health, I don't think I'm at a huge risk of getting really sick from this thing, but just I'm also avoiding economic damage. So I think it's I'm doing fine. I'm really worried about the country. Even if the best case scenario comes to pass in 8 weeks from now, we can go out to eat and stuff again. Just the economic damage is horrible, but I'm hanging in there. I should say I'm usually much more handsome than this, but because of this self-isolation, I'm wearing this raggy shirt, my hair's all messed up.
Yeah, you've really
I'm usually like
you've let yourself go over the past 5 days. You're practically unrecognizable.
In the last 12 hours. I did eat half a bag of Cheetos last night, which is not something I usually do. So, anyway.
Yeah, and I think I was joking that one of the most of the industries in the world are being negatively affected by this. Podcasting is maybe one of the few non-medical related industries that is actually could have a boom time because people are stuck at home and need entertainment, and if they don't want to keep on streaming on Netflix or whatever, they can listen to podcasts. Although maybe the advertisers that are like Casper mattresses and MeUndies and stuff are going to be suffering. Although those are mail order things, so that could be not so bad. And I should say also for the record, we've done a couple of these in the past, and I've mentioned this that we've known each other for actually a very long time. We met as teenagers and are friends. So let's note that for the record. Okay, so we're going to be talking about a piece that you wrote and was published in 1843, which is the magazine of The Economist, a relatively new magazine, I think, but.
Yeah, I think it's been around a little while. It's sort of their long form, it comes out every 2 months, just longer form articles, feature articles in there. It's weird because, 1843, no one's heard of it. Everyone's heard of The Economist, so sort of the branding issue there. But, 1843.
And I assume 1843 was the year The Economist was founded?
Yeah, I forget.
That would be my guess. Okay, but the article is called The Rise of PTSD. Yep. And so that is our main topic today. And so how did you arrive at this topic as something you wanted to write a long essay about?
Yeah, I think sometimes when you're a journalist, you pick up some idea and you work on it for a while. You have to set it aside or it mutates a little bit. So in my case, there's a anti-PTSD program the military set up in around 2009. That's actually, I'm working on a book, and one of my chapters is about it, why this program is not scientifically backed. And through that, I just sort of ended up learning a lot about PTSD and reading folks like Rich McNally at Harvard is like one of the sort of real godfathers of PTSD research. And, you get to read a lot as a journalist. And I learned a lot about it. And I realized I didn't realize going in how many people recover from traumatic events on their own. I think we have this cultural narrative that if something really bad and scary happens to you, you are traumatized, full stop, and you'll need some sort of treatment to recover. And I was really interested to learn that the most common response to a really traumatic event is you will have some symptoms, and that could be anxiety or depression or flashbacks even, but over time they tend to go away. That's the most common outcome, is they go away. And I mixed that finding with like some of the stuff going on in the culture right now, where there's like a certain, you want to phrase this carefully because there are a lot of genuine victims in society, but there is a certain cultural currency that comes from saying I'm a victim. Like I've been harmed. I'm a member of a group that's had bad stuff happen to us. So just those two things, the fact that most people recover on their own and that there could be some benefits to seeing yourself as a victim. It just struck me as interesting. And I think those two mixed with my editor at 1843 just wanting to write about trauma in general. And this was sort of the piece we came up with.
Mm-hmm. So it's a very interesting piece. We'll link to it below, encourage people to read it. So it's kind of the, it seems like, so you start with an example of a woman you interview, but let's kind of start more chronologically. So maybe the kind of the first understanding of trauma comes out of World War I. Our understanding of like PTSD comes out of World War I, and this idea of shell shock, and also this word that I'm not sure how to pronounce, neurasthenia. Is that how you say it?
I think so. Yeah, I'm actually not sure. I know it. I think I've only typed it. Right. So, to simplify a lot of military history, militaries and governments have always tried to figure out what to do with the fact that some soldiers become severely psychically damaged by what happens to them. And the most likely outcome in the past has been, these soldiers are told they're crazy, they're unwanted, they've been subjected to everything from electroshock therapy to other cruel treatments. So in a certain sense, like governments either didn't know or didn't take seriously the fact that it's a completely normal reaction to something like war to develop PTSD. And soldiers were not treated well for a very long time. I mean, we obviously still have a ways to go on that front, but it really wasn't until the Vietnam War that veterans groups and anti-war groups organized to say, like, these guys need help, because obviously coming home from Vietnam, people had all sorts of difficult problems. But it wasn't until 1980 when PTSD was introduced into the DSM that there was actually a name for this thing, which of course not only applies to veterans of military conflict, but to rape victims and disaster survivors and abuse survivors and a lot of other people.
Mm-hmm. You're just pausing on World War I. It's interesting. I took a class in college that was called Europe in the Age of Total War, and the professor's argument was like World War I was the first total war and that the entire society was involved in it, and there was nowhere, like the battlefield was all-encompassing, and civilians were targeted, but also like the the bombardment when you were like at the front or something was kind of like nonstop. And whereas before, if we look at like the 19th century wars or earlier, it was more like the battles were kind of these like 1 day or so affairs, and then like there would be other stuff, but the main action was kind of quickly ended, and then maybe like that would be it. So like war changed with mechanization and all these other things, and it seems like it became not only just massively deadlier, but also a lot more psychologically damaging, that you couldn't. There was no escape from the horrors that were going on around you, and so. But it took a while for, like you said, Vietnam is where you say that, I guess, does the term PTSD come out of the post-Vietnam experience, or is it later than that?
No, so it was introduced clinically in 1980. I'm actually not sure it's sort of like the first time it was uttered. I assume it came out of the DSM subcommittee that tried to figure out what to call this new thing. Mm-hmm. But yeah, people didn't talk about PTSD as PTSD until around then.
Okay. And so what are like the commonly understood characteristics of PTSD?
Yeah, so it's basically conceived of as, we have this fight or flight response, which is when something startles you or threatens you, your body reacts in certain psychological and physiological ways. And that's evolutionarily adaptive because, like, in evolutionary time, a tiger suddenly jumps out of the bush and your body's ready to go, either to fight it or perhaps more wisely to run away. what they think happens with PTSD is certain elements of your body's fight or flight response almost short circuit or get redirected. So what you'll see is, for example, if a soldier is ambushed on a bridge, they might come home and find they have a lot of trouble going near a bridge or crossing a bridge. And, unfortunately now the word trigger is sort of culture war fodder, but like it's very real for PTSD sufferer. Like you could see a bridge or approach a bridge and have all sorts of awful reactions. You could have a really profound panic attack. In that and other situations, you can actually flash back to horrible things that have happened to you. I think perhaps the most characteristic symptom is avoidance, which is avoiding things that might trigger these responses. And that's bad because, it locks you. For example, a lot of veterans, restaurants are hard for them because restaurants are crowded, and they might feel like they need to sit with their back to a wall so they can see the exit just to escape at all times. And for that and other reasons, they might avoid social interactions. And avoidance is really sort of locks you away from other people. It can lock you away from treatment. So when you talk to PTSD experts, they'll often say, yeah, I mean, there's all these other symptoms, but avoidance is sort of the key thing that you need to address if someone's gonna get healthier.
Mm-hmm. And so was part of the fact that this came out of the Vietnam War that the returning veterans had kind of like a political movement to like fight for recognition and treatment in a way that, like you talk about, like in World War II, obviously there were horrors that psychically damaged, millions of people, but maybe just like the cultural moment then was like, just don't talk about it. That's over. We'll forget about it. You'll be fine. We'll get back to regular life. And then like there had been enough of a change that the veterans could say like, no, like we need paid medical treatment or something like that. Is that what happened?
Yeah, I think it's a couple different sort of historical trends. And as always, it's very hard to sort of boil this down to any one or even two trajectories. But think about 1945 versus 1975, how different the idea of American masculinity was. Like it was very stoic and pragmatic and just get shit done in the 40s in the World War II era. By 1975, you'd had this whole sort of hippy dippy revolution. You had Esalen, you had all this stuff that sort of emphasized that it was okay to be a man who also felt things and who talked about stuff. And of course, in Vietnam, there was still a lot of macho masculinity, but I think that did open the door a crack for people to really talk about traumatic events. The other big thing you see historians talk about is there was a almost complete cultural consensus that World War II was a just war. Like we had to fight it once we were in, at least. Vietnam tore the country apart along the lines of whether or not the war was justified. And I think it should be the case we care for anyone who's traumatized, whatever the circumstances. But I think if you come back from a war that people realize is just a quagmire and a disaster and pointless, that probably gives your political movement a little bit more thrust to advocate on behalf of veterans, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a kind of, I don't know if it's exactly a paradox, but like, so World War II ended, it was this, it was a total war. I used that term earlier. Like the entire society was involved in it and producing munitions and stuff like that. And, millions of men were deployed abroad. And then it ended, huge celebrations. Everyone's happy. And then like, great. We did a great thing. We defeated the Nazis and Hitler. And like, okay, let's not, we don't need to deal with like anything, the after effects of that. Whereas like Vietnam, it was like a much slower end to the conflict. What is the official end date of the Vietnam War? Is it like, 1975 is when Saigon was abandoned or whatever, but like all the troops are by 72 or something. And so, and there was no big parade, I assume, or, VV Day or something, which actually was portrayed in side note in that Watchmen series on HBO. They had VV Day where the alien god Dr. Manhattan wins the Vietnam War. But anyway, so there wasn't like we did it kind of thing. But it was kind of like this it became this kind of shameful thing. And then some of the people who were involved were like, no, we're not putting this behind us. Even though like it is shameful, like what we did. So I don't know if I said that clearly, but it seems like a weird kind of, things got flipped.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in both. So I have an Audie Murphy quote in front of me. He was a famous World War II veteran and performance artist. He said, "After the war, they took army dogs and rehabilitated them for civilian life, but they turned soldiers into civilians immediately and let them sink or swim." So I think soldiers in both cases came back, feeling ignored and disregarded. But I just, you can imagine how sort of the cultural currents of the 40s and then 50s just made this stuff harder to talk about. And also, I mean, maybe also I'm speculating here, but like those soldiers came back and there was a massive economic boom, and it really was one of the, not for everyone, the gains weren't distributed equally, but it was one of the most productive, happy times in recent American history versus post-Vietnam era. It was not the same at all. So just different situations.
Right. And I wonder, I've never seen like an essay about this, but I have thought in the past, like, the like the baby boomer generation, like their parents were mostly of the World War II generation, and a lot of the dads in those families would have fought, and then they came back, and it's not like they went into therapy, they just bottled it up, and then like all the things that, like, how many things in American history did that lead to? Like, did the revolutions of the 60s, like were some of the 60s upheavals like reactions against the deeply damaged fathers who were raising these kids? Like, it sounds kind of, I don't know, it sounds kind of goofy, but I think there's something there. Like it shaped it shaped the childhood of the boomers who are still still in charge in this country and have to exert massive influence. Okay, so getting back to, so what was the like treatment that was, once this term came to be of post-traumatic stress disorder, what was the treatment that they devised?
Right. I mean, I'm most sort of up to date on the treatments that are well validated now. There a lot of them have to do with cognitive behavioral therapy, which is, basically rewiring your thought patterns in a more adaptive way. So in a military setting, they have a version of CBT called CBT, or cognitive processing therapy. And I talked to Patricia Rezick for my book. She's one of the, I don't think this made it into the story, but she's one of the leading experts. She developed this technique. And so let's say you have a soldier and a lot of his PTSD suffering stems from the fact that he lost a good friend of his during one particular battle. He might develop the idea, this was my fault. I didn't do everything he could. I didn't run out under fire to rescue him. And the whole idea is to like help people realize, no, like war is really random. There's not really anything you could have done. It's totally normal to feel this way, but it's just not your fault. So part of it is just, just trying to get people to think about what happened to them in a more adaptive way. And that could be a whole other conversation about, it's sort of controversial because, like, I don't know, you can see how that could be problematic. But there's another, there's a weird treatment called rapid eye movement desensitization, where you basically have people move their eyes in certain ways while revisiting their traumas or their triggers, and it seems to work, and no one's quite sure exactly why. Like, it's harder to tell the story I just told about cognitive processing therapy for why this works. But between those two and a few other validated techniques, there's pretty good recovery rates for people who have bad PTSD over time and then gain access to validated treatment. Not everyone. There's people who suffer forever, but there really is good treatment available. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so a lot of it is talk therapy, and then also this unusual procedure with the eye movements. Was medication involved in this also?
We talked about this less in the article, but I think a lot of the best outcomes are a combination of sorry, I'm about to sneeze. Excuse me. All your viewers now have coronavirus. It's a combination of various medications, and one of these is often provides some of the best outcomes.
Okay. So then this kind of like there is a cultural change like associated with this, that people understand what PTSD is. They have sympathy for veterans, whereas maybe 50 years before, like someone who like locked themselves in their bedroom after coming back from war would have been seen as a pathetic person or something like that. But then there's also like a cultural shift involving our discussion of what counts as trauma, and or what things can be discussed publicly at all, and then what should be the treatment for those kind of people. So talk more about that.
Yeah, well, so basically the trajectory, at least since PTSD was introduced, is like where society is more and more open to talking about trauma. Like, the young women I talked about who were sexually assaulted, for example, 20 or 30 years ago, maybe you just don't talk about that at all. And obviously stigma is still a big issue for a lot of sexual assault victims. But so we've seen the trajectory move in a positive direction where it's better and better to talk about this stuff. What's also happened, though, is as some people have pointed out, like Nicholas Haslam is an Australian psychologist who wrote about this idea of concept creep, where sort of if you look culturally and linguistically, the idea of what is like psychologically damaging seems to be expanding outward, and more experiences that we wouldn't have considered harmful or even traumatic are now considered that. So it could be, according to some guidelines or some resources, if you experience a one-off act of bullying as an adult in the workplace, that could be considered traumatizing. And 20 or 30 years ago, people probably would not take that seriously. And I think we're both too online, and we see on Twitter how people will sometimes say they've been traumatized by like someone, frankly, making fun of them or quote retweeting them. And it's mostly an offline phenomenon, but it happens online too. And so the question becomes, there is significant evidence to suggest that for people with PTSD, there is some element of self-fulfilling prophecy here. And this is where I get uncomfortable, because I'm not like a pull yourself up by your bootstraps guy. I don't think you can just like look on the bright side and make stuff better. But the best people who study PTSD believe that people who latch onto their own trauma and who believe they're permanently damaged are likely to have worse outcomes. And there was a really poignant example of this from Rich McNally, the Harvard researcher I mentioned. He ran group therapy sessions with Vietnam veterans. And he said he often sort of saw the worst outcomes among veterans who would still come in uniform with like their medals and stuff, because they had never let go of the Vietnam War. They had never let go of the idea that this should be the central organizing event of their life. And you can't ignore or let go what happened to you, but you can find a way to integrate it into a more complicated story about your life. Like, this was a thing that happened to me and it was bad, but it doesn't define who I am. And I think, according to the clinicians I spoke with, that's the most adaptive way to respond to a traumatic event.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is all very complicated. So we should not tread carefully. No, yeah. So 30 years ago, a woman who was raped maybe wouldn't have been believed at all, or told like, let's just not talk about that. Let's forget it. Like, okay, it was a bad thing, but like, just forget it. The culture is continuing to change. The Me Too movement and what came out after Weinstein has exposed that there was more sexual assault and other bad deeds than most people understood previously. So these things are always changing. So there's people who maybe had been sexually assaulted at some point in their lives, and then like put it behind them, and then like the Me Too movement starts, and then maybe they're like, oh, I am a rape survivor, or something like that, and that's like a new identity they take on. And then in the online realm, you see this like, so you see this especially among seemingly younger people who like put in their Twitter bios like all the mental illnesses they have or think they have, or other things. So it might say something like sexual assault survivor, borderline personality disorder, right. I love Power Rangers, she, her, or something like that. Like that's right. That's what they're presenting as their online identity. And then you mentioned, triggering before, like this has become a kind of a joke, but yeah, you still see it, like it's more become like content warning I've seen rather than trigger warning. But, someone will be like, I'm about to discuss rape, sexual assaults, blah, blah, blah. And they put it all on top there, and that makes everyone, it just, I don't know whether it seems like that hurts things along what you're saying, but I don't know where I'm going with this. We're obviously in a time of cultural change, and as you mentioned earlier, it does, in certain circles, being a victim does give you a sort of inverse power related to what it has like in the rest of society, where you can say like, this happened to me, I'm the one who can speak on this subject. You have to respect me about this.
Well, I also think there's a more, that's that's absolutely true. And I've seen that a lot, but there's also like the more basic, people want to have an identity. And like, if you go onto support networks, you see a fair number of people who appear to be self-diagnosed with whatever, with PTSD, depression, anorexia. And, imagine if you were, it's hard for us to imagine because we were so cool when we were 15 and we were like championship quarterbacks. But like, imagine if you were 15 and you just like didn't have much of an identity and you found it, and, you were experiencing some sort of vague mental health problem and you found a PTSD community, and you go in and you announce you have PTSD, and everyone, tells you they feel bad for you and they accept you. So I think there's like a poignant, I think there's a small subset of people who do this stuff in bad faith, especially like older people our age who are like really weaponizing their identity. But a lot of it, I think, is just a search for identity. And it's interesting to live in a time where these formerly stigmatized identities and experiences are now, people build their identities around them, at least online. I think it's a fascinating subject. I wish there was a way to talk about it where we, don't fall into culture war bullshit, because I think it's an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, I agree. And so, I mean, another thing is that we live in traumatic times. Like,
yes.
Going back to 9/11, the Afghan and Iraq wars, Hurricane Katrina, the financial crisis, the election of Donald Trump. These are all traumatizing in various ways to various different groups of people, and now we have coronavirus, which might be the first truly global trauma since World War II. I don't know. Maybe that's exaggerating. Like, maybe like the economic downturn affected everyone, but we're all suddenly experiencing this bizarre thing simultaneously, and there's going to be people who are traumatized by it, either because they contracted coronavirus and recovered, a loved one passed away from it, or just they were stuck in their house for 3 months and that affected them negatively psychologically. Like I can see that happening easily. Yeah. If you're prone to depression or anxiety, being cooped up by yourself for months on end is definitely bad. So there's a lot of trauma to go around, and at the same time, the research you highlight indicates that viewing yourself as a trauma victim as part of your core identity is, cements that the negative PTSD kind of symptoms into you more than viewing it as like something that happened to you, but you've moved beyond it.
Yeah, I think all else being equal, which it rarely is, that's true. That's what researchers believe is true. Yeah, I mean, you're right. This is a horribly traumatizing time. I can't really think of anything other than something like World War II. I guess, people should just realize that trauma does have certain psychological and physical effects. And if you experience these effects, like if you experience 1 or 2 or 3 PTSD symptoms, that's totally normal. I mean, the way I hear trauma described is often by experts is a normal response to an abnormal situation. Like, this is what our bodies do. And we are living in a very abnormal situation. So I think I just don't want people to think like, if they feel themselves starting to freak out, A, that's abnormal. It's not. It's normal. It's a normal response to an abnormal situation. B, don't assume it's permanent. Like, for most people, these symptoms will abate in time, statistically. If they don't for you, there's validated effective treatments if you are lucky enough to have access to them, but separate subject. But yeah, I think like the biggest takeaway just studying trauma in general, learning about it, is people don't realize how normal it is and how often it is that it goes away on its own, the worst symptoms. So yeah, I mean, you're right. This is like a horrible international natural experiment in trauma right now. And even just being cooped up, even if you're not physically affected or don't have relatives affected, like, it's going to deal a really bad mental health toll to a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, it's somewhat akin to being in prison. Like, not as bad, but like, especially if they start, as happened in Italy, of being like, you can't leave the house at all unless you're like going to the doctor or getting food, I guess. Then like the cops will come and like yell at you. Then like you really are stuck in your house, and then. Yeah, not as bad as prison, but maybe some of the similar like psychological effects will come to pass as people who are like in solitary confinement or something. So what are if someone presents with some of these PTSD like symptoms today from any sort of trauma, a confirmed trauma, not like an imagined trauma, like what is the state of the art treatment right now?
Yeah, I think it's things like cognitive processing therapy, rapid I always mix up the words. Let me make sure I have the name right so people can't lose Google this. EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR. EMDR, various cognitive behavioral therapies. The psychiatrist might add some medication to that. There's a number of options, and there's sort of these big documents that health organizations put out with like the best current treatments. This is all, it's an evolving area of research. Like, I don't want to make it sound like, there's some magic bullet, but I do think it's an area where like real substantive progress has been made. And, just going back to that question of like feeling helpless or out of control, A, your symptoms will likely go away in time. B, if you don't, this is something that a lot of people have dealt with and been successfully treated for. And actually in a military context, I mean, the biggest problem with Iraq and Afghanistan veterans has been they come home and they don't gain access to care. I think that's a combination of stigma, sometimes logistically if they can't get to a VA regularly, but the problem is less that we don't know how to treat it and more that they don't get connected to treatment. I'd imagine that's a microcosm for the US because we're so crappy on mental health stuff in general.
Yeah. And certainly if you're, many insurances don't cover mental health treatment at all if you're not, outside the military, and it's costs $100 an hour or something along those lines. I wonder, now that we have suddenly entered this era of, kind of like telemedicine, the necessity of telemedicine being a lot more important, I wonder how that is going to play out. I mean, this is not specific to trauma, but, people are, therapy is usually conducted in person, and now suddenly that's no longer possible. So you're doing it over the phone or over Skype or something like that. I wonder how that is going to
imagine if you're someone who like, I'm not presently in therapy. I've been in therapy, but like, imagine if you go twice a week and you're suddenly completely cut off from your therapist, which is awful to think about. It's hard to even try to quantify the kind of damage it's going to do. And I just feel really bad for the people more affected by it.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully some kind of, we do have these Skype and Zoom and things like this now. And I wonder how Zoom is somehow processing, because it seems like every school is now being run, run through Zoom and college classes and everything. And hopefully they have a lot of, dedicated servers or something.
Yeah.
But anyway, maybe hopefully something will evolve where people who need to talk to a professional can do it over their computer, over the phone, if they can't, if they are advised not to leave the house. So let me see. I don't know if I have. Okay, well, maybe let's talk just a little bit more about this kind of like cultural shift in which, talking about like, okay, so it's obviously a good thing that like we've moved long past the era where like, at least in some parts of the country, maybe in some subcultures within America, it is no longer shameful if you have a mental illness, and it is no longer shameful if you were sexually assaulted or something. It's not seen as like your fault. So we've mostly moved on that, maybe not everywhere. So that's a good thing. But as you point out, there is this irony that like maybe not that we've gone too far exactly, but that the things that seeing yourself this way, which has gained cultural currency in the past 10 years or so, actually makes you feel worse in terms of your mental health. Is there anything? Do you see a solution to that? I mean, it seems like, as you said, like there's people who maybe are saying like, if you were bullied at work, then you are traumatized because of that, and you can conceive of like maybe if your boss like unloads on you or something like that, you can conceivably see that. But do you see? Is there a way to counteract this or undo this? Like going like this thing where it's become harmful.
Not necessarily. I mean, not to be too pessimistic, just more open understanding and education about what trauma is. Like, I keep thinking, I found this Reddit thread where this kid who seemed very young was like, it was a PTSD thread, and this kid's like, I have a startle. My dad has a very loud voice, and whenever I hear my dad call my name, I was like, I have a startle response. I clearly have PTSD. And no one responded like, well, maybe you don't, maybe you should get checked out. Everyone was just like, yeah, you have PTSD. And I just think about situations like that, like, well, no, you probably don't have PTSD. There's a million reasons you could be startled by your dad yelling your name. And I just wish people didn't jump to conclusions on stuff like this, because I don't think it necessarily helps you be, healthy and adaptive and stuff. So, but yeah, beyond that, I mean, this is all just like big swirling cultural currents that are complicated. And in many cases, like, we're talking about a backlash to stigma, a backlash to various forms of oppression. So I understand why people want to sort of flip the script and embrace these identities. It's an empirical question whether it's healthy to do so.
Mm-hmm. And we don't need to name the people involved. You sent me a tweet from yesterday where there was a person who tweeted, a well-known journalist who tweeted that like she was gaining weight because she was at home and like snacking all the time. And I guess she must have said like I gained 8 pounds or something like that. And then another person replied to that, castigating her for like kind of triggering people with eating disorders because she named she had a number in there. Is that what? Am I describing this accurately?
Yeah. I mean so look, I want to be empathetic to people, but it's also like, I don't think you can have it both ways. I don't think you can be on Twitter and actively on Twitter and expect everyone to tweet in a way that will work around your own issues and traumas. Like, it's just not. Yeah, I don't want to be mean and be like, maybe you shouldn't be on Twitter, but if it really affects you that much, and this is a professional journalist, the person who complained, who like,
yeah, so this wasn't just a random person who was a professional journalist.
I mean, I don't want to be a jerk, but like, I don't think it's reasonable to expect other people to. I mean, imagine if we applied that to everyone's triggers about everything. People do have triggers, but it's not realistic. But I do think, maybe I'm overthinking this, but like, this was a situation where one journalist was significantly more famous than the other, and you sort of see a lot of this like trying to claw up. There's these weird social dynamics in journalism where like the more of a platform you have, the more people like try to tear you down, and I always think that's part of it. It's not just this triggered me. There's like, I'm speculating here, but yeah, that's just the kind of thing where like, I'm sorry, but I get a little bit curmudgeonly about stuff like that, I guess, is how I'd put it.
Yeah, it seems impossible if you think through everyone's triggers. I mean, think about, you mentioned before someone who a soldier who had an incident on a bridge, so that person can't see an image of a bridge, so someone tweets their photo they took, their selfie in front of the Golden Gate Bridge, and then they get castigated. Don't you know that some people jump off that bridge and die? Right. You can kind of play this out in an infinite number of ways. So, and then just for reason unknown, the person number one in this little anecdote deleted the original tweet in which she said that she had gained 8 pounds or something like that.
She's a friend of mine. I talked to her yesterday just to catch up. She just deleted it because she's like, I'm not gonna deal with this.
Yeah,
She recently had basically, when you have a platform like hers, people will just like email your boss and try to fire you over nothing, which she's had happen to her. So yeah, she just didn't want to deal with it. But yeah, again, like, it's like, but it's also like, what if my friend who was the guilty person here, what if she has, this isn't true, but what if she has weight issues and it helps her vent, to talk about it, to talk about her own frustration? I'm not a fan of the whole policing everyone. It reminded me, when I was at New York Mag, I wrote a story. I think the Times or someone wrote a story about how these social justice activists at, I think, Brown University, I think it was an Ivy League school, they were so stressed out and traumatized by all their social justice work for, I think, Black Lives Matter, that they were missing class and stuff. And I was like, you don't want to sound like a dick when you say this, but if you're so stressed out that you're having like panic attacks about your activism, you're not going to be a very effective activist. Maybe you should take some time off from the activism and like get this idea that, like, similarly, if you're really getting triggered and having panic attacks or anxiety attacks from going on Twitter, what's more realistic? Like, asking everyone to tweet in a way that works itself around your issues, or just maybe not going on Twitter for a while. So yeah. I'm an evil reactionary is what I'm saying.
Right. I think if you are that sensitive around specific words or numbers in this case, you need to avoid, the place where people are constantly writing all sorts of stuff, and you never know what it's going to be, or just unfollow people who list a lot of numbers or small amounts of weight or whatever, upset this particular person.
Right.
Okay, so I think that's. Do you have anything else you want to say about trauma before we wrap up?
No, I had one unrelated thing I wanted to say, but if there's anything else on trauma you want to ask first,
I don't think I have anything else on trauma. I did want to ask you to briefly describe the book you're working on.
Yeah.
So you can do that or discuss the other thing you want to mention.
Yeah, no, the book is called The Quick Fix. We're still waiting for an official release date. It'll be out in about a year if books still exist then. It's sort of about these like TED Talky social psychology ideas that often get adopted by schools or the military. These ideas we get very excited about that seem like revolutionary new ways to address trauma or to address education gaps or racism, and just why these ideas tend not to work out despite all the excitement surrounding them. And it's sort of a critique of a certain American individualism that we're going to solve problems by fixing individuals rather than structures. That's a slight, oversimplification, but that's the thrust of the book. And I'm been working on it a while. I'm very excited to see it out in the world when that finally happens.
Cool. Well, when that happens, we're happy to have you back on Blogging Aids if Blogging Aids still exists in a year. Although, like I said, this is a pretty small organization that is doesn't need a massive infrastructure, and we're cocooned in our houses doing it. So I think we're going to persevere.
If you're the last person on Earth, I expect you to die while. Not to be morbid, but while recording the final Blogging Heads.
Yeah, that'd be one way to go out.
That's how I want it.
Okay, is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, some of your viewers and listeners might know Katie Herzog, very problematic journalist and a friend of mine. We're going to record 1 or 2 pilot podcasts about online bullshit, about the weirdest, craziest online stuff and what it can sort of teach us about human nature. Ideally, this would be a podcast even those dreaded normies could listen to and learn something about human nature and the internet. And I figure a lot of your audience is too online the way I am. So we're just looking for feedback on the kinds of stuff you'd like us to talk about. This is a total experiment. Might not work out, but we're all locked at home anyway, and we've been talking about doing this for a while, so we're going to give it a shot.
Okay, cool. Yeah, Katie was just on Feminine Chaos as with Kat Rosenfield and Phoebe Maltz-Bovey as a guest, and has been a guest on this show before. Yes, very very controversial figure, and she works for what is her paper called? The Seattle.
She's on furlough at The Stranger, which is
right, which is the alt weekly in Seattle, yeah. And one thing I had never even thought about. Like second order effect of all this is like those alt weeklies rely a lot on advertising from restaurants and comedy events and concerts and stuff, and once all those stop, the advertising stops, and then they can't make payroll. So Katie is even though she writes about like politics and culture and stuff, not restaurants, like she got furloughed from that, and so all that's just one of the many kind of depressing things that's rolled out, and we're just at the beginning of them. So I hope the podcast goes off. I'm feeling that we're about to enter a period when tens of thousands of new podcasts are going to be launched every day as people are stuck at home and trying to figure out something to do with their free time. So yeah, good luck to that. And so say the name of the podcast again.
Oh, we don't know. That's one of the things we could use advice on.
Okay, so it's still in the still in the works. Okay, so check your Twitter feed or Katie's Twitter feed if
anyone can email us or tweet at us if you have ideas about either the name or sort of what we should cover. But
well, it's certainly a fertile ground for for picking apart.
Yeah, exactly. And then probably I was wondering if Twitter is going to get better or worse during coronavirus, because a lot of normies are probably joining, but the crazy people are only going to get crazier, and you're going to have things like you mentioned gaining weight, so I'm triggered. Sorry, I should not make fun of it. Like a lot of these people, yeah. All right, I'm going to get myself in trouble if I talk much more. So okay, yeah, Twitter is only going to get worse as people are more and more cooped up.
and had nothing else to do besides like get into obscure fights with strangers online.
We're in like a temporary period now where people are not having their usual feuds mostly, I think. But I think like once people are cooped up for another week or two, they'll just go back to the same bullshit.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. There's a kind of like, we're still all kind of shocked and adjusting to this new reality, and people are like, well, you know, I don't need to have a giant fight about which is the best, you know, My Little Pony character. I was
going to say, when you said the best, I was going to say race. You said My Little Pony character.
Well, yeah, those
important arguments either way.
Yeah, those are the two big online arguments are My Little Pony and you know, race realism. So those will probably start up again soon. Okay, so Jesse, thank you for coming on. Good luck in our new reality of quarantine. I think we'll be okay. I hope we'll be okay.
People should really like not interact with others. I've had trouble with that, but really stay home. Because we're the two people they're looking to for guidance on what to do. So just so we're clear about this.
Yeah. Aryeh and Jesse say stay home. I told all my Twitter followers, hey, wash your hands, and use soap. Don't forget about the soap. So okay, so thank you, Jesse. Thank you to all of our viewers and listeners, and we'll see you again next time.
Thanks, guys.